Tanner had learned a long time ago that some truths were easier to carry alone. He was 34 when he met Claire. By then he had already accepted that he might never become a father. At 22, Tanner had been diagnosed with cancer. The treatment saved his life, but it came with a devastating consequence. His doctors later told him that the chemotherapy had left him permanently infertile. He had cried that night not because he was afraid of dying, but because he had always dreamed of having a family. Years passed. Then he met Claire. She was warm, funny, and full of plans for the future. Tanner loved her almost immediately, but he never told her about the infertility. It wasn't because he wanted to deceive her. He was simply terrified. He worried that if Claire knew she would see him differently, maybe she would leave. Maybe she would decide that loving him wasn't worth giving up the possibility of having children. So Tanner stayed silent. They married 2 years later. For the first few months, everything felt perfect. They talked about buying a house, traveling, and someday having children. Whenever Claire mentioned babies, Tanner would smile and change the subject. Then Claire started acting differently. She became secretive with her phone. She came home late. She smiled at messages Tanner couldn't see. He noticed, but he didn't ask. He was afraid of the answer. 16 months earlier, Claire had reconnected with an old college boyfriend at a friend's wedding. His name was Daniel. At first, she told herself they were only catching up. Then they started texting, then meeting secretly. And eventually their relationship became an affair. Tanner knew nothing. Until one Saturday afternoon, both families gathered in Claire's parents' backyard for a barbecue. The atmosphere was cheerful. Music played softly while everyone ate and talked. Then Claire stood up. She placed one hand over her stomach and smiled. "I have something to tell everyone." The conversation stopped. Claire looked at Tanner. Impregnant. For a second, Tanner couldn't breathe. Then everyone exploded with happiness. Claire's mother began crying. Her father hugged her. Tanner's parents congratulated them. Someone shouted, "It's a miracle." Tanner forced a smile. But inside something was breaking. He knew it wasn't a miracle. It was impossible. He had been sterile for more than a decade. Claire walked toward him and wrapped her arms around him. "You're going to be a father," she whispered. Tanner looked into her eyes. For the first time in their marriage, he couldn't recognize the woman standing in front of him. That night, after everyone had gone home, Tanner sat alone in the living room. Claire was upstairs. His hands were shaking. He opened an old medical file he had kept hidden in a drawer. The words were still there. Permanent infertility. He stared at the page for several minutes. Then he heard Claire walking downstairs. "Tanner?" He quickly closed the file. "Yeah." She entered the room. "Are you happy?" He looked at her. "I don't know." Her smile disappeared. "What does that mean?" Tanner stood. "It means we need to talk." Claire's face became pale. "About what?" Tanner took a slow breath. "I can't have children, Claire." Silence filled the room. Claire stared at him. "What?" "I've been sterile since my cancer treatment." Her eyes filled with tears. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was scared." She looked away. Tanner watched her carefully. Then he asked the question that had been haunting him since the barbecue. "Claire, whose baby is it?" She didn't answer. That silence was enough. Tanner's heart sank. Claire finally whispered, "Tanner, I'm sorry." He closed his eyes. He had spent years believing that the hardest thing cancer had taken from him was the possibility of becoming a father. He realized that night it had also taught him something else. Sometimes the truth hurts less than living inside a lie. But he wasn't ready for what Claire would tell him next. Claire sat on the couch with her face buried in her hands. Tanner remained standing across from her. "Daniel?" she finally whispered. Tanner felt the name hit him like a physical blow. "Daniel." She nodded. "The baby is his." For several seconds, Tanner said nothing. He wanted to scream. He wanted to throw something. Instead, he simply asked how long. Claire cried harder. 16 months. Tanner stared at her. 16 months. It started after that wedding. "So you've been lying to me for 16 months?" "Yes." He looked toward the window. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. People were living ordinary lives while Tanner's entire world had collapsed. "Did you ever love me?" he asked. Claire looked up. "I do love you." Tanner shook his head. "Love doesn't look like this." She had no answer. The next morning, Tanner left the house. He didn't go to work. He drove to the hospital where he had received his cancer treatment years earlier. He sat in the parking lot for almost an hour before entering. His old doctor was no longer there, but Tanner obtained copies of his medical records. The diagnosis was clear. There was no possibility that the pregnancy could be his naturally. He already knew. But somehow seeing it on paper made everything real. For the next few days, Tanner barely spoke to Claire. She asked him to forgive her. She promised that Daniel meant nothing now. She said she wanted to save their marriage. But Tanner had one question. Why did you tell everyone it was a miracle? Claire began crying. Because I was afraid. Afraid of what? That everyone would know? Tanner nodded slowly. So you let everyone believe I was the father? I didn't know what else to do. You could have told the truth. Claire looked down. You're right. Weeks passed. Tanner moved into a small apartment. He didn't hate the unborn child. That surprised him. The baby had done nothing wrong. His anger belonged to the adults who had created the situation. One evening, Claire came to his apartment. She was holding an envelope. I need you to see this. Inside were medical documents. Daniel had refused to accept responsibility for the baby. He had told Claire that he didn't want a relationship with her. He didn't want to be a father. Claire was now alone. She looked at Tanner. I know I don't deserve your help. Tanner folded the papers. You're right. She began to cry. But I need to know something, he continued. What? Do you want this marriage? Because you love me or because you're afraid of raising this child alone? Claire couldn't answer immediately. Finally, she whispered. At first I wanted you because I was scared. Tanner nodded. And now, she looked directly into his eyes. Now I know what I lost. Tanner felt tears forming. He had imagined this moment many times. He had imagined forgiving her. He had imagined leaving her. But real life was never as simple as imagination. I can't promise we'll ever be together again, he said. I understand, but I don't want this child to grow up believing they were unwanted. Claire nodded through her tears. Months later, the baby was born. A little girl. Claire named her Lily. Tanner visited the hospital. He stood beside the tiny crib and looked at the sleeping child. She wasn't his daughter by blood, but she was an innocent human being who had entered a broken situation without choosing any of it. Tanner gently touched her tiny hand. Claire watched from the bed. You're very kind, she whispered. Tanner looked at her. No, I'm just trying not to let your choices turn me into someone I don't want to be. He left the hospital that evening with a strange feeling in his heart. He had lost a marriage. He had lost the future he thought he understood. But he had finally found something more important. The courage to face the truth. Tanner never returned to the marriage. Claire eventually rebuilt her life and accepted responsibility for what she had done. And Lily grew up knowing that her parents had made mistakes, but that none of those mistakes were her fault. Years later, Tanner became a volunteer at a cancer support center, helping young survivors deal with the emotional consequences of treatment. Whenever someone asked him if he regretted surviving, he always gave the same answer. No? Then he would smile. Survival doesn't promise you an easy life. It only gives you another chance to live honestly. And Tanner finally understood something he had forgotten years ago. A miracle isn't always getting what you dreamed of. Sometimes the real miracle is finding the strength to walk away from a life built on lies and still choose to become a better person.